January 17th, 1945. Somewhere in the Ardennes, the snow falls in silence. Not the gentle silence of a winter's evening, but the hollow silence that follows thunder. The kind that settles over battlefields when the guns finally stop. In a makeshift aid station carved from the shell of a Belgian farmhouse, a German nurse kneels beside a dying soldier. Her hands, raw and cracked from cold, press a bandage soaked through with blood against a wound she knows will not close. The boy, he cannot be more than 19, whispers for his mother. She does not tell him that his mother may already be ash in the ruins of Dresden or Hamburg. She does not tell him that the Reich he believed would last 1,000 years is collapsing like wet paper in the rain. She only holds the bandage and watches the light fade from his eyes. By nightfall, American voices echo through the farmhouse walls. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last great gamble in the West, is unraveling. The nurse hears boots on frozen ground, the metallic click of rifles being readied, the low commands in a language she learned in school but never thought she would hear spoken by conquerors. She rises slowly, her white uniform stained with the blood of 100 men, and steps into the cold. In her mind, she has already rehearsed what comes next. She has heard the stories, whispered in field hospitals, passed between orderlies in the dark, about what happens to women when armies break through lines. She knows what the Red Army did in East Prussia. She knows what soldiers do when rage and victory meet in the ruins of war. She knows, and she braces herself for it. But what she does not know, what none of them know, not her, not the 30 other German nurses huddled in the frozen barn, not the doctors with their exhausted eyes and trembling hands, is that in less than 72 hours, they will be sitting at tables with clean white tablecloths, eating warm bread and drinking real coffee, served by American soldiers who call them ma'am. To understand the shock of this moment, you must first understand what these women expected. You must understand the machinery of fear that the Third Reich constructed within its own people, the narratives that shaped their final days of war. By January 1945, Germany was no longer fighting for empire. It was fighting for existence. The Allied bombing campaigns had turned German cities into craters of ash and bone. Hamburg burned in firestorms that melted flesh to stone. Dresden would soon follow. Berlin was next. To the east, the Soviet Red Army advanced with a rage sharpened by 3.5 years of German occupation, years of burned villages, mass executions, and starvation sieges. Stories of Soviet retribution flooded westward with the refugees. Women violated in streets, children shot before their parents, entire families executed in their homes. The Wehrmacht's own atrocities had sown the seeds of this harvest, and now the crop was coming due. German propaganda did not need to fabricate the terror of the Eastern Front. It only needed to amplify it. Goebbels's broadcasts painted the Soviets as subhuman avengers, bent on the extermination of the German people. And if the Soviets were monsters, what would the Americans be? Germany had declared war on the United States in December 1941, aligning itself fully with Japan after Pearl Harbor. For years, Nazi propaganda had depicted Americans as racially mongrelized, culturally degenerate, militarily incompetent, a nation of gangsters and weaklings. But by 1945, that narrative had curdled into something else, a quiet, unspoken dread. The Americans were no longer a joke. They had stormed Normandy, shattered the Atlantic Wall, and were now grinding through the Siegfried Line with industrial relentlessness. If the Soviets fought with rage, the Americans fought with something perhaps more terrifying: cold, mechanized efficiency. And in the chaos of collapsing armies and burning cities, German soldiers and civilians alike faced a grim calculus. Surrender to the Soviets meant probable death. Surrender to the Americans meant what exactly? No one knew. The uncertainty itself was a kind of terror. For the nurses, the fear was sharper and more intimate. War has always reserved particular horrors for women. The German medical corps included thousands of women, nurses, assistants, administrators, who served in field hospitals, evacuation trains, and frontline aid stations. They were not soldiers, but they wore the uniform. They served the Wehrmacht. They had stitched together men who would return to kill Allied soldiers. In the moral calculus of total war, where did that place them? Would the Americans see them as medical personnel protected under the Geneva Conventions? Or would they see them as collaborators, as enablers of the Nazi war machine? And if the Americans did see them as the latter, what mercy could they expect? The women had no answers. They had only the stories whispered between cots in the dark, the rumors carried by retreating soldiers, the silence of their superiors when asked what would happen if they were captured. And so, when the American voices grew louder and the farmhouse doors swung open, when the first GI stepped inside with his rifle lowered and his eyes scanning the room, the nurses stood frozen, not with defiance, but with the blank, empty readiness of people who have already accepted the worst. What happened next would shatter every assumption they carried. The American soldier, a corporal from Ohio, according to the records, looked at the nurses for a long moment. He took in the blood-soaked uniforms, the exhaustion carved into their faces, the way their hands trembled despite their stillness. Then he lowered his rifle completely, slung it over his shoulder, and said in halting school-taught German, "You are safe now. We need your help with the wounded." The head nurse, a woman named Margarete Hoffman, according to later Red Cross documents, would recall in a 1947 interview that she did not believe him at first. "I thought it was a trick," she said. "I thought they would take us outside, away from witnesses, and then it would happen. I had seen how men look at women in war. This man did not look at us that way. I did not understand it." But there was no trick. Within an hour, the German nurses were working alongside American medics in a commandeered church, treating wounded from both sides. The Americans brought supplies, real morphine, clean bandages, sulfa powder, plasma, things the German Medical Corps had not seen in steady supply for months. They brought food, K-rations, crackers, canned meat. One American lieutenant, seeing Hoffman sway with exhaustion, pressed a chocolate bar into her hand. "Eat," he said. "You can't work if you collapse." She ate. And then she wept. This was not an isolated incident. As Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany in the winter and spring of 1945, they captured hundreds of German medical personnel. Doctors, orderlies, nurses. The pattern repeated itself with startling consistency. Initial terror, braced resistance, and then, almost universally, bewilderment. The Americans treated them not as criminals, but as medical professionals. They were disarmed, yes. They were confined to specific areas, yes. But they were not brutalized. They were not starved. They were not violated. Instead, they were put to work. American field commanders, faced with overwhelming casualties from the Battle of the Bulge and the push into the Rhineland, needed every medically trained hand they could get. German nurses found themselves working in Allied field hospitals, often under the supervision of American nurses who treated them with brisk professionalism. They were given food, rations identical to what American personnel received. They were given clean water, medical supplies, even cigarettes. When they asked why, the answer was always some variation of the same theme. Your medical personnel. Geneva Convention, the Geneva Convention. To the German nurses, it was a phrase they had heard in training, but never quite believed would apply to them. The Third Reich had signed the conventions, yes, but it had also systematically violated them on the Eastern Front. The nurses had seen their own army treat Soviet prisoners as subhuman labor, worked to death in camps and factories. They had heard, though few spoke of it openly, about the extermination camps, the places where the sick and the weak were not healed but erased. And yet here were the Americans, citing international law as if it mattered, as if words written in Geneva in 1929 carried actual weight in the mud and blood of 1945. One nurse, Erika Schmidt, captured in March 1945 near Remagen, later described the cognitive dissonance in stark terms. "We had been taught that the Americans were weak, that they valued comfort over duty, that their soldiers were criminals and minorities who could not fight. But when I was captured, they treated us better than our own officers had. They gave us warm coats. They made sure we had sanitary facilities separate from the men. When one of the guards made a crude joke, an American sergeant reprimanded him in front of us. I realized then that everything we had been told was a lie, not just exaggerated, a complete inversion of the truth. The symbolic heart of this transformation was food. In the landscape of total war, food is never just sustenance. It is power, it is mercy, it is ideology made edible. By 1945, Germany was starving. The Allied blockade, the diversion of resources to the war machine, the collapse of transportation networks, all of it combined to create a nation running on fumes and ersatz coffee. German soldiers at the front received rations that shrank with each passing month, bread mixed with sawdust, watery soups, meat that may have been horse, may have been worse. The nurses, working in field hospitals, often went without meals entirely, giving their portions to the wounded. Hunger was a constant companion, a gnawing presence that dulled thought and sapped strength. And then came the Americans, with their incomprehensible abundance. The K-ration, that waxed cardboard box of compressed pragmatism, contained more food than many German soldiers saw in 2 days. Crackers, canned meat, chocolate, cigarettes, instant coffee, sugar tablets, chewing gum. To the German nurses, it was almost obscene. How could a nation at war produce such plenty? How could an army carry such luxuries to the front? One nurse, captured near Aachen, recalled staring at a can of Spam, processed pork shoulder in a small tin, and being unable to comprehend the logistics of it. WWII, they brought meat in cans to the front lines, she said in a 1950s oral history interview. Meat that did not spoil, that needed no refrigeration, that could be eaten cold. We had been told the Americans were on the verge of collapse, that their economy was failing. But you cannot ship meat in cans across an ocean and feed millions of soldiers if your economy is failing. That is when I understood we had lost. Not because of the battles, but because of the cans. The food was not charity exactly. It was policy. The United States military understood that well-fed prisoners were easier to manage, less prone to disease, more cooperative. It was pragmatism dressed as decency. But to the recipients, starving and exhausted, the distinction did not matter. A German nurse who received a full meal, hot coffee, bread with butter, a portion of stew with actual vegetables, did not care whether it came from strategy or compassion. She only knew that the enemy was feeding her, and her own army had not. The chocolate was particularly potent. American Hershey bars, the D-ration chocolate specifically designed to sustain soldiers in the field, became a kind of currency and symbol in the closing months of the war. The bars were hard, slightly bitter, designed not to melt in tropical heat or freeze solid in winter cold. To American GIs, they were emergency rations, barely palatable. To German nurses who had not tasted real chocolate in years, they were miracles. One account describes a nurse breaking down in tears when a young American soldier handed her a D-ration bar, not as payment or bribery, but simply as a gesture. "Son, here," he said. "You look like you need this more than me." She ate it slowly, one small square at a time, making it last. Later, she would say it was the first moment she truly believed she might survive the war. But it was not just food that unmade the Nazi worldview. It was respect. It was the small, almost invisible courtesies that Americans extended as a matter of course. The use of ma'am when addressing nurses. The establishment of separate, guarded facilities for women prisoners, protecting them from both Allied and German male prisoners. The provision of soap, of clean uniforms, of basic dignity. These were not grand gestures. They were not the stuff of propaganda films or heroic narratives. They were simply the baseline assumption of American military culture that even enemies, even women who had served the Wehrmacht, deserved basic human decency. This shocked the German nurses more than any battlefield reversal. They had been raised in a culture that exalted hierarchy, that drew sharp lines between worthy and unworthy, that justified cruelty as strength. The Third Reich's ideology was built on contempt. Contempt for the weak, for the foreign, for the different. And here were the Americans, treating captured enemies with a casualness that bordered on indifference to ideology. One nurse recalled an American doctor working alongside her in a field hospital, stitching a German soldier's leg, chatting about baseball. "He did not hate us," she said. That was the strangest thing. He did not hate us. He acted as if this was just a job, unpleasant but necessary. And when it was done, he would go home and forget about it. We had been told Americans were crusaders, that they wanted to destroy Germany. But this man just wanted to finish his shift and play cards. This was, in fact, closer to the truth than Nazi propaganda had ever come. For most American soldiers, the war in Europe was not an ideological crusade. It was a job that needed doing, a problem that needed solving. They did not fight because they hated Germans. They fought because their country had been attacked, because their allies needed help, because it was the right thing to do. This pragmatic, almost businesslike approach to war was incomprehensible to people raised on Wagnerian myths of heroic struggle and existential conflict. The Americans treated war like they treated everything else, as a challenge to be overcome with organization, resources, and a certain grim humor. They did not glorify suffering. They did not romanticize death. They simply got the job done and moved on. For the German nurses, witnessing this was a kind of revelation. The propaganda had been wrong, yes, but it was wrong in a way that cut deeper than simple lies. It had inverted reality so completely that the truth felt like a hallucination. One nurse, Ilse Bauer, captured in April 1945 as Berlin fell, would later write in her memoirs, "I had been taught that strength meant hardness, that mercy was weakness, that the strong devoured the weak. But the Americans were strong, and they were not hard. They were strong, and they were kind. I did not have words for this. My entire life, I had been taught that these things could not exist together. And yet, here they were. The transformation was not universal, and it was not instant. Some nurses remained committed to the Nazi cause, convinced that the American kindness was a trick, a temporary mask that would slip once victory was complete. Some clung to the belief that Germany's defeat was the result of betrayal, of weakness, of anything except the fundamental moral and strategic bankruptcy of the regime they had served. But for many, perhaps most, the experience of captivity became the beginning of a painful reassessment. They had been told their entire lives that they were the master race, that their culture was superior, that their enemies were subhuman, and then those enemies had treated them with more humanity than they had ever shown their captives. The cognitive dissonance was, for some, unbearable. There are accounts of German nurses who refused to eat American food, who insisted on remaining in their soiled uniforms rather than accept clean ones from the enemy, who viewed any cooperation as betrayal. These women were, in a sense, the last true believers, not in Hitler necessarily, but in the worldview that Hitler had crystallized and exploited. They could not accept the evidence of their senses because it unmade the architecture of meaning they had built their lives upon. If the Americans were not monsters, if the war was not a righteous struggle, if Germany had not been fighting for survival but for conquest, then what had it all been for? What did the dead boys whispering for their mothers die for? What had the cities burned for? What had they themselves sacrificed for? These were questions without comfortable answers, and so some refused to ask them. But others did ask. Others allowed themselves to see. And what they saw changed them in ways that would ripple through the decades to come. Margarete Hoffmann, the head nurse captured in the Ardennes, would emigrate to the United States in 1949. She became a surgical nurse in Chicago, working until her retirement in 1978. In interviews late in her life, she spoke carefully about her wartime service, neither excusing it nor wallowing in guilt. "I was young," she said. "I believed what I was told. And then I learned that what I believed was a lie. That learning did not erase what I had done, but it changed what I would do next." She became active in veterans' reconciliation efforts, in programs that brought together former enemies to talk about their experiences. She never forgot the corporal from Ohio who told her she was safe, who spoke in halting German and meant it. Erika Schmidt, captured near Remagen, returned to Germany and became a teacher. She made it her mission to ensure that her students learned actual history, not the sanitized myths or the bitter recriminations, but the full, complicated truth of what had happened and why. She kept, until her death in 1989, the empty wrapper of a Hershey bar given to her by an American soldier in March 1945. When asked why, she said simply, "To remember that the enemy was kinder than the lie." The American treatment of German nurses was not, it must be said, purely altruistic. Military necessity played a large role. The United States needed medical personnel, and captured German nurses were skilled. German-speaking professionals who could treat German prisoners of war more effectively than American medics who did not speak the language. Using them made logistical sense. Additionally, the United States was already looking beyond the war's end, already thinking about the occupation, about the need to rebuild a stable, non-hostile Germany. Treating captured personnel well was part of a broader strategy to undermine Nazi ideology. to demonstrate through action that the Allied cause was just. Every German nurse who was treated with decency, who returned to her family and community with stories of American fairness, was a living refutation of Goebbels's propaganda. But strategy and decency are not mutually exclusive. The fact that kindness served American interests does not make it less real. The corporal from Ohio who told Margaret Hoffman she was safe probably was not thinking about post-war reconstruction. He was probably thinking about getting through the day without more people dying. The lieutenant who gave her chocolate was not executing a psychological operation. He was, most likely, just a man who saw another human being in need and acted on the simple, almost automatic impulse to help. These small acts, multiplied across thousands of interactions, created a reality that no amount of propaganda could obscure. The contrast with the Eastern Front was stark and deliberate. By 1945, stories of Soviet treatment of German prisoners and civilians had become a driving force in German military behavior. German soldiers fought ferociously to hold the Eastern lines, not out of loyalty to Hitler, but out of terror of what awaited them if the Soviets broke through. And their terror was not unfounded. The Red Army's advance into Germany was accompanied by mass rape, summary executions, and wholesale looting. Soviet commanders, when they bothered to address the issue at all, often justified it as righteous payback for German atrocities in the Soviet Union. And indeed, the Wehrmacht's conduct on the Eastern Front had been genocidal in scale and intent. The siege of Leningrad alone killed over 1 million Soviet civilians. Einsatzgruppen death squads murdered more than 1 million Jews and others in mass shootings. Soviet prisoners of war died by the millions in German camps, starved and worked to death. The rage that drove Soviet soldiers westward was not fabricated by propaganda. It was earned. The Americans, by contrast, had not experienced war on their soil. No American city had been bombed. No American village had been burned. The trauma of Pearl Harbor was real, but it was distant, contained, not the visceral, personal horror of occupation and genocide. This meant that American soldiers could approach German prisoners with a certain emotional distance. They had no burning need for revenge, no personal scores to settle. They were, in a sense, free to be professional. This was not moral superiority. It was circumstance. Had the Germans occupied Chicago or New York, had they murdered American civilians by the millions, the American response might have been very different. But they had not, and so Americans could afford to be merciful. Yet even acknowledging the role of circumstance and strategy, something else was at work. The American treatment of German nurses reflected a deeper cultural assumption, one so embedded that most Americans did not even articulate it. The belief that all people possess inherent dignity, that rights are not granted by the state but exist prior to it, that even enemies deserve certain protections. This was Enlightenment philosophy filtered through 2 centuries of American experience, mixed with Christian notions of mercy and redemption, tempered by the pragmatism of a nation built by immigrants and frontier negotiation. It was not perfectly applied. American racism and segregation made a mockery of these ideals at home, but it was present, a kind of cultural reflex that shaped behavior even when individuals were not consciously thinking about it. German nurses, raised in a system that taught them to view rights as privileges granted by the state to the worthy, encountered this American assumption and found it alien. They had been taught that mercy was weakness, that only strength mattered, that the world was a Darwinian struggle where the strong dominated and the weak perished. The Nazi regime had made this worldview explicit, but it drew on deeper currents in German militarism and romantic nationalism. And then came the Americans with their Spam and their chocolate and their casual insistence that even defeated enemies deserved coffee and cigarettes and the use of ma'am. It was not just kindness. It was a different way of seeing the world, a different answer to the question of what humans owed each other. One German nurse, whose name was lost in the chaos of post-war displaced persons camps, left behind a diary fragment that was later preserved in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's archives. The entry, dated April 1945, reads in part, "Today, an American Negro soldier brought us bread. I had been taught that Negroes were subhuman, barely above animals. But this man spoke to us gently, called us ladies, and made sure we had enough to eat before he left. I have been thinking about this all evening. If everything I was taught about Negroes was a lie, what else was a lie? And if the Americans, whom we despised, are treating us with such decency, what does that say about us? I am afraid to follow this thought to its conclusion, but I cannot stop thinking it. This diary fragment encapsulates the quiet, internal revolution that took place in the minds of many German nurses during the final months of the war and the occupation that followed. It was not a dramatic, cinematic moment. It was the slow, painful erosion of certainty, the gradual realization that the entire edifice of meaning they had built their lives upon was rotten at its foundation. Each small interaction, a shared cigarette, a cup of coffee, a polite nod, was another crack in the wall. And when the wall finally came down, what remained was not heroism or tragedy, but the simple, unbearable recognition of shared humanity. The American soldiers who treated German nurses with decency were not saints. They were not acting out of deep philosophical conviction. Most of them were just young men who wanted to go home, who were following orders, who treated the people around them the way they had been raised to treat people. But in doing so, they inadvertently became agents of a profound ideological defeat. They proved through their actions that democracy and abundance were not signs of weakness, but sources of strength, that a nation could be powerful without being cruel, that victory did not require brutality. This was a lesson that Germany as a nation would take decades to fully internalize. But for the individual nurses who experienced it firsthand, the learning was immediate and irreversible. In the years after the war, as Germany was divided and rebuilt, as the Cold War calcified former allies into enemies and former enemies into allies, the story of the German nurses became a footnote, a small anecdote in the vast literature of World War II. It did not fit neatly into the narratives that either side wanted to tell. For West Germany, eager to rehabilitate itself and align with the United States, it was an uncomfortable reminder of how deeply the Nazi lies had penetrated, how thoroughly they had been believed. For East Germany, it complicated the narrative of American imperialism and Soviet liberation. For the United States, it was simply one of many examples of American decency, notable but not extraordinary. And so it faded from collective memory, preserved mostly in personal letters, in scattered interviews, in the quiet recollections of women who lived into the 1980s and 1990s and sometimes, late in life, agreed to speak about what they had seen. But the story matters, because it illustrates a truth that is easy to forget in an age of ideology and abstraction. That kindness is a weapon, that decency is a strategy, that the simple act of treating enemies as humans can achieve what no bomb or bullet can. The Americans who gave chocolate to starving nurses were not thinking about psychological warfare. They were not consciously undermining Nazi ideology. They were just doing what seemed right. But in doing so, they won a victory more complete than any battlefield triumph. They forced their enemies to question everything they had been taught, to confront the possibility that they had been wrong, that they had served a lie, that the enemy they had feared was, in fact, their salvation. This is the uncomfortable paradox at the heart of the story. The German nurses were not innocent. They had served the Wehrmacht. They had stitched together soldiers who returned to fight and kill. They had worked within a system built on conquest and genocide. They bore responsibility, even if they had not pulled triggers or signed deportation orders. And yet, in their moment of greatest vulnerability, they were treated with a mercy that their own system had never extended to its enemies. This mercy did not absolve them. It did not erase their complicity, but it gave them the chance to change, to become something other than what they had been. And many of them took that chance. The snow still falls in the Ardennes, though the farmhouses have been rebuilt, and the scars of battle have long since faded into the landscape. Margarete Hoffmann is gone now, and Erika Schmidt, and Ilse Bauer, and the unnamed nurse who wrote about the American Negro soldier. Their generation has passed, carrying with it the direct, lived memory of that moment when the world they thought they knew revealed itself to be a fiction. But their stories remain, fragments and echoes, preserved in archives and oral histories, in the memories of children and grandchildren, in the small, persistent insistence that what happened mattered. What did it mean? That moment when a German nurse looked into the eyes of an American soldier and saw not hatred but indifference, not cruelty but tired professionalism? What did it mean that the enemy offered chocolate? that the conqueror said, "Ma'am," that the victor cited the Geneva Convention, as if words on paper could bind the strong to the weak. It meant, perhaps, that there are ways of being powerful that do not require being monstrous. It meant that abundance can be a form of argument, that full stomachs and warm coats can undermine ideology more effectively than any propaganda. It meant that the simple, almost banal decency of a democracy at war can achieve what tyranny never can: the voluntary transformation of the enemy's heart. This is not a comfortable lesson. It does not fit easily into narratives of good and evil, of righteous struggle and deserved suffering. It complicates the story we tell about war, about enemies, about justice. But it is true, in the way that small, specific moments are true, in the way that a diary fragment, or an oral history, or an empty candy wrapper preserved for 40 years is true. The German nurses, who could not believe they were treated with respect, learned something in their captivity, something that changed the trajectory of their lives and, in small but real ways, the trajectory of a nation. They learned that they had been lied to, that the enemy was not a monster, that the world was not what they had been taught it was, and in learning that, they became the evidence of a different kind of victory. Not the victory of arms, but the victory of ideas, of the stubborn, persistent belief that even in war, even in the face of evil, decency matters and mercy has power. The chocolate bar given to a starving woman, the coffee offered to an exhausted nurse, the simple, almost thoughtless use of "ma'am," these were not grand gestures. They were not the stuff of monuments or medals. But they changed minds in a way that bombs never could. They planted seeds that would grow, slowly and unevenly, into the recognition that there are better ways to be human than the ones they had been taught. The snow falls. The farmhouses are rebuilt. The generation that remembers is gone. But the lesson remains, quiet and persistent, that in the end, it is not the cruelty of our enemies that defines us, but the mercy we extend to them. And in that mercy, if we are lucky, lies the possibility of transformation, not just of the enemy, but of ourselves.